Well, again, good afternoon. Is that your phone now? That's yours? We'd like to start our program now, so please continue to enjoy your lunch, but we are going to turn it over to the panel. And to introduce the panel, I would like in turn to introduce Al Tyree, who is the Director for Business Development and Learning Solutions at the Graduate School USA. And he will do the honors of the introductions. Al.
Good afternoon, and again, Al Tyree, Director of Business Development and Learning Solutions for the Graduate School, and on behalf of the school, I can't tell you how excited we are to be participating as sponsor of today's luncheon. In addition to introducing our panelists today, part of my role at the Graduate School is developing partnerships, strategic partnerships, building coalitions with organizations and agencies and even individuals whose missions, goals, and aspirations complement each other. And I can't think of any better example than the relationship between the Graduate School USA and ICGFM. I just want to read something to you that talks about dedicated to improving financial management so governments may better serve their citizens by providing opportunities for professional development and information exchange. Now, I pulled that right off of the CGFM website, but you could have easily looked at the Graduate School's financial management website and found the same language. So just wanted to mention that. To our panelists, Jorge da Silva, who is joining us, and I promise, sir, next time we meet, I will have the pronunciation correct. He's the executive auditor of the Inter-American Development Bank, and is certainly someone whose works and accomplishments, both in the public and private sector, have significantly and positively impacted the efficiency and economy of those organizations who have looked to him for his guidance. He brings more than 25 years of private and public sector experience in internal auditing, accounting, risk management, internal controls, and information technology. Prior to joining the IDB, Mr. Da Silva was the Chief Audit Executive at the Canadian International Development Agency in Ottawa, Canada. His background also includes being Director of Audit Services and Director of Finance and Administration at the International Development Research Center, also in Ottawa, Canada. I did a little web research upon getting ready for this, and at least by spelling, there are no shortage of web references to individuals with that name. In fact, Mr. Da Silva says it's kind of like how we look at John Smith in the United States. So I had to be sure, because I've found out he's not the midfielder or the soccer player or the actor of the same name. But I had to be sure. I brought my pen for a autograph just in case. But suffice it to say, a very distinguished career. So welcome, Mr. Da Silva. Thank you. Mr. Mohamedou Dieng, the Director of Strategy and Operations for the World Bank Group, Internal Audit Vice Presidency, and brings to the institution over 20 years of experience in accounting and auditing. Prior to joining the World Bank, Mr. Dieng held senior positions at Fannie Mae, Arthur Andersen, Deloitte & Touche. He's also a member of the AICPA and holds an MBA and Master of Science degrees with a concentration in finance. Welcome, MD.
Thank you.
Daniel Nelson joined the IMF in October 2004 as Assistant Director at the Office of Internal Audit and Inspection in the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Prior to that, he worked at the UN World Food Program and with Price Waterhouse. He's also served as a member of the Audit Committee of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. Now, in going back to my research, I did find later that Mr. Nelson's an avid biker. So you have to be sure when you're doing your research. So, a welcome to all of our panelists. We hope that you enjoy the presentation. I'd like to turn things over to your moderator, Richard Hudson.
Excellent. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And panelists, no pressure. He's raised the bar quite high there from that introduction. For those who've not noticed, this ICGFM session is slightly different. And it is the first time that we are actually videoing the session. And this video will be published on YouTube and through the ICGFM website. The panelists are aware of that, so they will kind of moderate.
And we still did it.
But from the perspective, my intent is to ask a few initial questions. It's the same function, but the organizations are different, and it's the way it's performed in the organizations is different, and the challenges are different. So in the beginning, we're just going to sort of move through a set of questions that I've prepared for the panelists, and they've had time to consider. For probably the last 15 minutes, we'd like to obviously turn questions over to yourselves. So please capture questions as we go, and we'll have some roving mics and a camera ready when you ask your questions. So the rules don't just apply to the panel, they apply to the audience as well. So from the perspective of the first question, I'd like you to, and we'll go through each of you individually, probably starting with Mohamedou, describe the mission of the organization and describe how that mission influences the scope of the internal audit function in that organization. So starting with the World Bank.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Richard. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to exchange ideas with professionals of your caliber and also to network. So thank you for the opportunity of joining you for lunch today. The World Bank is essentially an organization devoted to fighting poverty around the world. It started off after the Second World War as a reconstruction bank to help Europe rebuild, but its mission has evolved ever since. But the primary focus today is helping developing countries around the world, and it does it through a number of programs in a variety of areas, whether it's agriculture, nutrition, healthcare, education, you name it. So that tells you that the range of activities in which the bank is involved is a pretty broad range of activities. When people talk about the World Bank, they actually think of only one entity, but actually it's a series of entities within the World Bank group. Actually 5 different entities. I will not go through each one of them, but it's 5 different entities that all are separate legal entities, but they serve the same mandate of fighting poverty, but they do it in very different ways. One, for example, is focused on the private sector. Another entity is more focused on the public sector and the like. But the mandate is essentially the same. And even the entity that's often referred to as the World Bank, which is IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is really the banking side. Actually, it's a misnomer because it's more than just a bank. It's not your traditional bank, as you think about it. I would say it's actually multiple institutions in one. Certainly, it is a bank. In terms of its lending activities, in terms of its funding activities, but also it is a not-for-profit organization in terms of the work it does to provide interest-free loans and grants to the poorest member countries. Besides being a bank and a not-for-profit, I would even venture to say it's also almost like an academic institution, a research institution that puts together a lot of research in many different areas, all the areas I mentioned before. So that really gives you a picture of an organization that's involved in a broad array of activities that has multiple entities within itself. It is obviously in a non-regulated environment. We are not regulated, and that has implications in terms of the operations of the institution. So these characteristics I talked about, the broad nature of the institution and the series of activities we're involved in, really mean from an internal audit standpoint, the coverage is very broad. We have a very broad range of coverage because we cover all the 5 entities that I mentioned, and our coverage includes the operations of the institutions in those very different sectors. The fact that it is a non-regulated institution has advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages from an internal audit focus is we're less focused on compliance aspect that you might find internal audit heavily focused on in some of the private sector regulated entities. We are more risk-driven, and we have a lot more latitude to consider strategic types of areas as opposed to just compliance. Now, the flip side of it is being in a non-regulated environment, you kind of lose the lever you have. Before coming to the World Bank, as Richard mentioned, I was in the private sector in a regulated financial institution. You have a lot of levers in those types of institutions in terms of really getting the entity to focus on certain issues, to address them in a prompt manner, and you really have a lot of leverage. Now, you lose that leverage if you are in an environment where you don't have that regulatory leverage and you don't have the market discipline of pushing certain things through. So I think those are some aspects of the bank that I would say impact both the scope of what we do and also the nature of our work.
Excellent. So, Georges, would you like to explain for the Inter-American Development Bank? And I notice a lot of your staff are here, so
that puts the pressure twice on me because I cannot go beyond that. No, but in many of the things that my colleague, that Muhammadu, more than a colleague, a friend, had pointed out, also identifies a number of things that we have in common. The bank the IDB was established in 1959, and it is very much the leading source of development financing in Latin America and the Caribbean. The shareholder base of the IDB is of 48 countries, 26 of whom are also borrowing countries. So it's very much concentrating on the Latin American and the Caribbean as far as the countries that borrow funds, but our shareholder base expands to beyond Latin America, involving Asian countries, European countries, and whatnot. Similarly to the World Bank that Muhammadu alluded to, our mandate has always been associated with the reduction of poverty, but also the elimination of inequality, basically. We do that by supporting those Latin American countries in fighting both poverty and inequality. The issue also for us that is important is how to do this, and it is about not only promoting development, but promoting sustainable development, promoting climate in a climate-friendly way. In other words, really being responsive to the environment in which we operate and being respectful of the environmental concerns that the organizations do have. Going back to what, just to give a little more sense about the bank, we are roughly 2,000 employees. If you include consultants, that number gets close to like 4,000 in terms of what the consulting base is. We operate in 26 offices because the 26 countries that I was talking to you about that are borrowing countries, that's where we actually have our country offices. We do have 2 offices, one in Tokyo and one in Madrid, which is pretty much their role is primarily one of promoting the activities of the bank, if you will, on both Asia and Europe. We have been, in terms of magnitude, just to give you a sense, in the 50 years that the bank has been in business, we have approved roughly $230 billion in loans, if you will. And just in the past year, this was roughly $13 billion. And we have disbursed of about $10 billion of that amount. How does this magnitude, the area in which we operate, and those constraints that I was talking to you about, how does that influence internal audit? Very much in line to what Muhammadu was saying. It's a deregulated environment, certain rules of the game in terms of having, by virtue of not having that regulatory environment, the compliance aspect is minimized in a way. Obviously, it is important to making sure that we are complying with our own rules and regulations, but there's a different connotation to that. For us, what we have decided as our strategic direction, if you will, for internal audit is really in terms of the essence of internal audit, which is continue to provide assurances on risk management, control, and governance. This is the very essence and definition of internal audit. We are going to also, one of the things that we have been spending a lot of time is to influencing the quality of both financial and non-financial information produced at the bank, because both of them are used for decision making. So we want to make sure that those things are working as they should. But one of the nuances that we have is also as an internal audit function to try to contribute to the improvement of the internal audit function in the countries we serve. Right. So this is not directly through the banking mechanisms, it's by us participating in events sponsored by the Institute of Internal Auditors as presenters or even as members of panels and whatnot, to really promoting the importance of this function in improving accountability, in improving stewardship for resources. And this is very much a part of what we do in the context of the mandate of the organization.
Excellent, thank you. Again, a very broad picture, a complex portfolio, and a similarity in terms of with the World Bank. So the IMF, Daniel, please.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to the ICGFM. It's very nice to be here. We're very pleased to attend, and thank you all for attending. Just in terms of, okay, the IMF is one of the two Bretton Woods institutions that were founded immediately prior to the end of the Second World War. The other being the World Bank. Now, frequently we hear of the IMF as being described as the lender of last resort. And in fact, that is what it also does. It gives loans to countries that are in financial difficulties. And that has been very much in the news in the last years because of the financial crisis. But in the last few years, that activity has actually gone down a lot compared to peaks that it had reached. So the other main function, if you will, of the IMF is what is called surveillance. And so surveillance means that each of the member countries of the IMF, and there are 188 member countries, the same as the World Bank, receives advice through a formal system that goes through the review and approval by our executive board, and also the related publishing of those pieces of advice. And we might touch upon that later a bit. And the third area that is within the IMF's activity is the technical assistance. And here, the focus of the technical assistance provided by the IMF is to improve the capacity and strengthen the capacity of member countries to develop effective policies in economics. How does this work? How does this impact the work of the internal audit at the IMF? Well, recently, our managing director reiterated that the intent of the organization is to make sure that the level of excellence that is applicable to the role of the IMF within the global economy is also applicable to the internal workings of the organization. So therefore, both from an operational perspective and also from an administrative perspective. So in that sense, even internal audit is expected to be performing at a level of excellence. This was also reiterated also recently by the selection to the position of one of the 4 deputy managing directors of the IMF of a chief administrative officer who is in charge of looking at all of the administrative and support functions, including internal audit. And in this sense, will also, our work would be focused indeed on this level of excellence, and also on the making sure that the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization is at the highest level possible. That's what I'll stop at that.
Excellent, thank you. And so you mentioned the deregulated nature and kind of the risk-based and strategic view. Perhaps starting with George, where do you find your institution kind of focuses most of its time? What areas it's primarily focused on?
The internal audit?
Yes,
function?
the internal audit.
I would venture to say, much like what you're saying about the regulated, a lot of the risks that we talk about might be the same as how important that risk is in an organization versus the other. So I would imagine that the array is the same. In the case of internal audit for the bank is going through a significant period of change, changing its technology, changing a number of its key processes, making sure that from a human resources perspective, the organization is equipped with the best resources possible in an environment that is competitive and whatnot. So that comes as no surprise then that these are some of the key areas that we have been focusing on. One of the challenges is a lot of those things are moving as we speak. So it's almost like you're changing the tires of your car as the car continues to move. But one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that if the internal audit function is indeed to contribute to the achievement of organizational objectives, we can't shy away from that responsibility. So one of the things that we do is to really try to understand what are the key things that are important to the organization in terms of its strategy, in terms of its challenges or whatnot, seeing to what extent we as internal audit can contribute in both of our roles, sometimes as an assurance provider, sometimes as an advisor, and ultimately recognizing that in many cases we are having to provide, it's not as if it's not audit as usual, that you look back and you see how things turned out. Right. You are watching things as they are moving, and you are providing advice or feedback or assurances in that environment. But I would have to say that technology changes, process changes, human resources capabilities are some of the things that are really attracting a lot of our attention as of late, simply because we want to make sure that the organization is equipped on those areas to remain competitive in this deregulated environment.
Excellent. So Mohamedou, we're aware, I mean, the World Bank is going through massive reorganization and change, and not necessarily leading the witness. I'm sort of interested in George's perspective of catching up and keeping ahead of and aligning the internal audit function with those changes. Do you see a similar thing? How would you address that question of how does internal audit and where do you direct most of your efforts in the World Bank?
No, absolutely. We are pretty much in the same process as the one that George has described for the Inter-American Development Bank. I mean, you've all been reading in the media that the World Bank is going through a lot of changes, has been going through a lot of changes over the past couple of years. And these changes, it's not like one area of the organization, it's impacting a number of things. It's the strategy, it's the operating model, it's the organizational structure, it's the finances of the organization with the commitment to cut about $400 million out of the bank's budget over the next 3 years, which is about 10% of our budget. Some leadership changes as well. So it's like a lot of things are changing simultaneously. And when an organization is in that situation where a lot of things are changing and a lot of things are changing at the same time, I think it presents both risks and opportunities at the same time. On the risk side of the ledger, obviously, you have to be very mindful as an internal auditor of what those changes mean from an internal control standpoint, from a risk management standpoint, from a governance standpoint. A lot of things are changing, and during that time, there could be situations in which perhaps not enough attention is given to some control impacts of the changes being made. And you need to be there to make sure that the controls are still working properly, and controls that may have been adequate in the previous environment may no longer be adequate in the new environment. So you have to be really putting on your critical hat and challenging whether the controls are following the pace of change of the organization. So from an audit standpoint, a lot of our work in the recent past has been focused on areas of strategy implementation, risk management, accountability and decision-making, those types of areas. But at the same time, I think we should not let the risk blur for us the opportunity that it presents, both for internal audit and for the organization as well. I think it presents a formidable opportunity for internal audit to be really putting on a different hat and being at the forefront of the change process as opposed to just reacting to it. And that's something we're trying to do. Just to give you a sense, in the past, I would say 2 or 3 years ago, the split in terms of our assurance versus advisory was essentially 80-20. 80% assurance, 20% advisory, give or take. As of today, the split is more 60-40, about 60% assurance, 40% advisory. And we think that's the right thing to do because it's important for us, in order for us to be change agents, it's important that we accompany the process and that we work with management and the audit committee as well. And the types of advisory projects we do fall on very different categories. For example, some of them are essentially missions to provide fact, to provide data to management. In some areas where we do fact-based analysis to provide management with objective data on some of the business processes so that the changes being made can effectively be calibrated based on objective data as opposed to based on assumptions. So we have those fact-based analysis that we do in multiple areas. In some cases, it could be post-mortems where we go back and look at a process that has failed or that did not work as expected in the past. And we really try to do a very detailed analysis to find out what worked well, what didn't work well, so that management can incorporate that feedback into the change process going forward. In other cases, it could be more forward-looking and doing benchmarking and comparing the practices we have at the bank versus the practices in similar institutions to feed that information to management so that, again, they can incorporate best practices into the change process. But I think it's very important that internal audit maintains the right balance. Now, I'm fully aware that there are different schools of thoughts in our industry, right, about how much advisory or quote-unquote consulting work internal audit should be doing. You do have a lot of proponents of, well, internal audit's role is to be a primary provider of assurance, and that's where we should stick to. I happen to have a different view. I don't think that there's any right or wrong split, whether it's 80-20, 50-50, or 30-70. It really doesn't matter. It has to be adapted to the context of the organization, and it has to be adapted to the particular phase the organization is going through. We believe that where we are right now is the right phase for the World Bank.
Excellent. Thank you. So Daniel.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
On the areas of which we would devote most of our attention, I think that while we are also undergoing changes continuously, they're not to the degree that I've just heard described. So in that sense, but there are changes. Changes are ongoing, and more specifically, while we have devoted our resources to, let's say, traditional support processes within the institution or financial areas, we too are shifting. We too are shifting, and in terms of internal audit, we could describe ourselves as being on a journey. The journey here is to shift away from these more traditional areas of audit to look at those processes instead that underpin the strategic directions of the fund. In that sense, to get closer to the core business functions, and there that's something we're trying to identify the right audits to do that, and not only that, but even in identifying which audits to do, we have limited resources all. So we want to make sure that we target specific issues that have the most impact throughout the organization. On the audit assurance versus advisory, we share the same view in the sense that for us this is a good area of opportunity to look into. There's no real specific formula that says what's the right amount and so forth. Both of these activities help address risks in one way or another within the institution. So we too are thinking of actually expanding in that area. And I think one issue that we've come across at the inception of this thought of expanding is to also help our clients understand what is the difference, though, between what is the assurance work compared to what the advisory work. Mm-hmm. Those were the thoughts that I wanted to share.
Excellent. So picking up on a few points there. One, closer knowledge of the strategic direction and full understanding of that strategic direction. The kind of differences from a pure assurance perspective or to an advisory perspective. I'm sort of interested in terms of your staff and the competencies you're looking for in your staff, and potentially what you're doing to sort of develop those competencies. And if you see, there is difference, how do you make them aware, and understanding of the strategic direction and understanding of this consulting role as opposed to a pure kind of assurance role. So George, do you want to chime in?
Much like what my colleagues have said, organizations are going through change, and so does audit, in order to remain relevant, in order to continue to provide that kind of value to the institution. And we are getting away from the traditional to going into areas where there's a lot more gray space. It's not about black and white. So the traditional skills of analytical skills, computer literacy, previous experience in audit are all very valuable. So they remain very important. They haven't gone away. But we really are starting to see an importance of our auditors to have that strategic thinking. So it's beyond just understanding a given system or a given application. It's to really having the ability to look, to really see the forests, but really not losing sight of the little pieces, but really thinking of it in a much macro way. Auditors have traditionally been more procedure-oriented. Let's make sure that certain things are working as they should. Now we have to elevate the conversation to a much broader perspective. So that ability of strategical thinking is very important. With that comes also the importance of negotiation skills. Because in many cases, it's not about, there's a lot of room for interpretation, there's a lot of room for discussions with management, and we really have to be able to convey an idea in a very convincing way. And also making sure that you understand what is negotiable, what's not, how it is that we can bring that into bear. I think it's extremely important. The other thing that comes to mind is data analytics. The importance of being able to really analyze a massive amount of data, and instead of just looking into that into a sample basis, to really identifying what are the trends that are, like going back into this idea of anticipating issues. We cannot just look back. Much like what my colleagues have said, you have to look back, you can't forget that, but you have to look beside your shoulders, but also forward. And the ability of having tools that allows you to do that and for you to interpret those tools and use them is extremely important. And one of the things, and I know I can't lie because my staff is here, and that I think is extremely important, is the notion of our clientele has also somewhat changed. You are going from being specifically operational and dealing with operational levels to really playing with the bigger boys, to really playing with the bigger girls in terms of their role in the organization. They talk differently, they think differently, they read differently. So good writing skills that allows you to communicate at that level as opposed to just operational are some of the things that we're looking for. So going back to and identifying like where do we do it, we have a very, I must admit, we're very proud of our human resources strategy, what we call our human capital strategy, which is to really bring bright, young people, groom them through the system so that they can be valuable either to us through promotions or through the bank through other competitions. So we bring them in, we hone them on internal audit, we hone them on what it is that the function of internal audit is, what the bank is, and as they move forward into the organization, like anybody else, our structure is finite. We have limited resources within audit, but we try to identify those individuals that if they cannot stay with us, they will add value to the organization somewhere else. So that's part of our mentality, is to try to bring that kind of bench strength to the organization. And we try to match that between the experience of those who have been in the banking industry or even in the bank for a good number of years with those young guns. Right. And matching them up so that they can truly exchange information and experiences so that they benefit from that and then can use in their careers.
Excellent. I mean, that was a very full answer, and I think that's not necessarily institution specific, but obviously I offer Daniel or Mohamedou an opportunity to add or comment on that.
No, I mean, I think, like you said, it was a full answer. I think George has absolutely hit it on the nail. What we're looking for, directionally speaking, is people who go above and beyond the foundational skills. Everyone agrees that the domain knowledge is important, whether it's IT, whether it's finance, whether it's forensics and what have you not. Nobody is arguing it, it's important. But it's like a foundation, that's why I call them foundational skills. Well, a foundation is not a house. You need to build something on top of it in order to get the house. And what you need to build on top of it is those transformational skills that George has talked about. I call them transformational skills because those are really the ones that allow you to be a change agent in the organization, the strategic thinking, the analytic thinking, the capacity to connect the dots and bring the strategic messaging. So I completely agree. And I would also completely concur with him in terms of you need to think differently in terms of staffing and really think about career development, think about strategic staffing. And those are easy things to talk about, but they are not easy things to implement. And we have a lot of constraints in our organizations that many of you are aware that make it extremely difficult to really bring the talented people, retain them, and more importantly, develop them and grow them in the organizations, because these are not organizations like General Electric or conglomerates that have hundreds of thousands of employees with thousands of business units where you have a lot of opportunities for promotions and other things. So as a manager, you have a limited toolbox. There are a lot of things you can do in the private sector with large organizations in terms of variable compensation, in terms of promotion, in terms of getting people different exposure that you might not have if you're in the context of these 2,000, 3,000 people organizations, or even 15,000 in the case of the World Bank. And then you think about internal audit, which is smaller, which is why it's extremely important to think broader than internal audit. When you think about professional development, you need to think of the entire organization. And I think those things are important. The only other point I would add as well is we need to think differently about the staffing model in the new environment we're in. I think in a lot of cases in the past, when we were staffing, we were thinking someone with an audit background. It doesn't have to be anymore. I think when we're recruiting, one thing we're trying to do is ask ourselves, who are the individuals who display those skills that George talked about, the analytic skills, the critical thinking, the capacity to think strategically. If someone has those skills, they may not be an auditor. But you know what? As much as I hate to disappoint you, internal audit is not rocket science. You can teach people to be internal audit. You get good people who have the right skills, the right attitude, the right hunger to learn and grow, and then teach them the auditing skills. I think that will allow you to recruit the right people. But if you're too narrow and thinking only in terms of internal auditors, I think that can limit your perspective. That's one thing I wanted to add. And the other thing is also in your staffing model, and I know some organizations are more comfortable with this than other organizations, but really thinking of the right blend between where you need to buy the expertise and have it in-house, and where you need to contract out in some cases and bring it on an as-needed basis, and really think about things like co-sourcing models, and really think strategically about what are the core areas I need to grow in-house, and what are some of the other areas where I take a more flexible approach. So I think it's a number of things that you have to think about simultaneously.
I'd just add, first of all, that I agree with all these points raised earlier. One angle that I would add to that, and which I think is consistent with what we just heard, is that in our own case, I think we're trying to shift so that we can raise our line of vision to address more of the strategic risks facing the institution. So that's an aspect or competency that we would like to, pull out further. It's consistent with what I mentioned earlier about the changes that we're undertaking. And in terms of risk, we also recently established a risk management unit, so that in that sense, when we talk about risk, we want to make sure that the auditor talking about risk is talking about risk in the institutional sense, and that we're speaking the same language as well. So in that sense, that's what I'd like to add.
Excellent. And I don't want to monopolize. I've got through 3 of my questions, and we could go all afternoon. But as promised, if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone over to you. If no one has any questions, I have a lot more. But
first of all, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. My question relates, I'm a public financial management advisor. Obviously, I'm more focused on development and sustainable development in terms of the role of government managing its resources. First of all, my question is, to what extent do you play, your organization, your internal audit organizations play in designing or in supporting sustainable development in partner countries outside of your organizations? Do you actually actively promote, for example, internal audit within the ministries of countries that you work in? The other question I have that I'd like you to comment is, there seems to be, at least in our line of work, a heavy focus on external audit or oversight institutions, as we call them, the supreme audit institutions, and much less on internal audit structures and procedures and processes within the governments that we actually work with. First of all, can you briefly explain your view of what internal versus external audits are? But more specifically, I think we need more attention and focus to the way governments run their businesses through the internal audit process, more so than the supreme audit institutions, which are more of a very high-level oversight process. This may be out of your scope, but I'd like for you to comment to what extent you actually work on these areas.
Okay. So I guess on the first aspect, which is work being done with countries in terms of, I guess, reinforcement of capacities and the like. I know George has mentioned that in your case you do a lot of it. In the case of the World Bank, actually, we don't do much from an internal audit perspective in that regards. And the reason is because of the architecture of our oversight institutions. Besides internal audit, we have a number of other organizations within the World Bank that do a lot of the things that we just mentioned. If you take the case, for example, of areas like procurement or financial management, for example, we have a lot of units within the bank that do that kind of interaction, working with the borrowers in the fiduciary risk management space in terms of reinforcement of their capacities. And we do work with those units, but they are pretty much on the front line, so that internal audit is more inward-looking in the case of the World Bank, whereas those other institutions are more focused on those aspects. Likewise, if you take areas like, for example, FNC, fraud and corruption, internal audit at the World Bank doesn't cover it. In many other organizations, they do. In the case of our institution, we have actually a unit that's fully dedicated to that, and that interfaces mostly with our clients, not just in terms of investigations, but also in some cases working on broader aspects of developing frameworks in the different countries and really helping them reinforce their ability to fight fraud and corruption. So unlike the Inter-American Development Bank, in our case, most of those tasks you're talking about are actually handled by other units, either fiduciary, risk management units, or some other oversight functions within our architecture. In terms of the second question about roles or differences of roles between internal and external audit, I mean, I think it's pretty much the same thing you see in other organizations. We are no different. The external auditors in the case of the World Bank are focused primarily on the financial statements and the integrity of the financial controls. Internal audit has a much broader remit within the organization. However, this being said, whilst we all understand that demarcation, I think one trend you've seen in the recent past is the need for all the functions that are dealing with risk, that are dealing with controls, to really work together and help the organization think about risk in a holistic manner, as opposed to the siloed approach where each one of them was focused vertically on one particular area. So internally, that's what we do with the other oversight functions. I mentioned that we have multiple oversight functions within the World Bank. We have some focused on evaluation of operations, some focused on FNC, some focused on audit like us, and we try to coordinate our actions to make sure that we don't create overlaps or we don't overlook certain gaps. But we do the same thing as well with our external auditors. We have a lot of exchanges and sharing of information and knowledge, and we think that's good for the organization. But by and large, the distinction is very much in line with what you see in other organizations, with the external auditors focusing on financials. Okay.
Just to complement, Yes, much like what Mohammed was saying, we also do have evaluation units that are primarily responsible for looking into the programming effectiveness of the organization. We have investigation units that do, in terms of wrongdoing investigations and whatnot. Let me just clarify in regards to our contribution, or the contribution of my unit in regards to the internal audit. There is one of the key things that the bank is very interested in is in building capacity in the countries that we serve. And this is not done, even in the case of audit, through us. They have units within the bank whose mandate, whose responsibility is to identify those opportunities to strengthen primarily external audit, because that's one of the vehicles that they use to making sure that things are working. So in regards to that, our role, the role that I was talking to you about earlier on when I'm saying about the contributions that we make, is we are given opportunities to participate in meetings sponsored by the Institute of Internal Auditors in Latin America at large. And that could be a specific country or could be a region. In those events, that's when we participate by sharing with them the good management practices, or by challenging them on how it is that they can move into that continuum to getting better. So the bank maintains the responsibility for, in terms of other parts of the organization, of identifying areas in which a given country can improve, including its institutional capacity. Mm-hmm. But we play a role just in those opportunities that we are given to do that. But other than that, is exactly what Mohammed was saying. In the case of the bank, the external auditors are primarily responsible for the financial statements and the financial discussion on the organization, and we play a much bigger role in the inwards of the organization, if you will. Obviously, there is a lot of coordination between us, so that we make sure that we contribute to each other's work, and sometimes we even, like discussing with them, there may be parts of their work program that we can execute ourselves, so that if it facilitates things a little more.
So Daniel?
Just simply to add, first of all, in the case of IMF, we don't have projects, so it is a different perspective, but I can add on the importance that we also attach to the coordination between the internal and the external audit. I mean, definitely, it is to be able to exchange as much information as possible on the risks facing the institution. Of course, the external auditor focuses more on the financial statements, but we need to provide as much information we can. Their attention will be at a higher level when there are matters in our reports that can have some direct or indirect impact on the financial statements. But that being said, again, we really agree fully with the full coordination with the external audit firm. Thank you.
Excellent. I want to kind of respect the lunch program. And I'm sure, folks, you would be available if individuals have follow-up questions. So I thank you for a wonderful overview and detailed on the respective organizations and the activities you perform. As I say, I think we could spend the whole afternoon on this. And I think George knows he needs a few folks to go to get back to work before the storm comes in.
The audit functions is stopped right now, because everybody's here.
So again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you also, and before we have the passage of our small token of appreciation, I'd like to thank everybody here for attending today. I hope you did find this, as I certainly did, the session very informative. The aspects of human capital and the capacity building challenges that are faced, not only within your organizations, but beyond with your client base as well, was very interesting, and I think similar to what many of us face, either in the work that we're providing, the support that we're putting out throughout the world, or within our organization, certainly. I would also like to invite everyone to join us next month on April 1st for our next forum, which is titled Implementation of Domestic Resource Mobilization in Developing Countries, by Robert Wirtz, who is the Director of the Office of Economic Policy at E3, and that is sponsored by KPMG. And if you haven't gone online and registered for our international conference the first week of June in Miami, where it's warm and sunny and quite beautiful.
Sign me
Please
up.
do, and we hope to see you there as well. So this is, the time of the day where we have our very, very sought after and important ICGFM pen that we pass out in very limited bases, but you guys have certainly deserve these, and we know that one of them will be used in Switzerland. So it truly is an international deal here.
Exactly right.
And I know the two of you have received these pens in the past, and I suspect they're in your pocket. I hope there's room for these here as well. So
I can take all three.
There you go.
okay, and then if we could, right after that, stop and pose for pictures, please. Thank you. Thank you all.
Way to go, guys.